Welcome to the 6th lecture in riparian function and management. In our last session, we examined riparian recovery and the dynamics and processes associated with the natural recovery process. Erosion and deposition, bankful discharge, sinuosity, width-depth ratio, gradient, recruitment, root density, channel stability, plant succession, and flooding. In the course of discussing particular riparian processes and dynamics, we examined a number of remarkable recovery stories. Your homework assignment was to gather all available data for your previously chosen creek site and create a data log for submissions and discussion. You are also encouraged to establish a photo point at your chosen site to begin recording your own recovery story. In this lesson, you will examine more closely the riparian recovery story on Bear Creek, one of the best documented processes yet. If you will recall, our definition of functioning condition involves having enough stuff, vegetation, landform, or large woody material to first and foremost dissipate stream energy. Then and only then do we begin to have stable banks, reduced erosion, sediment trapping, enlarged floodplains, stored water, floodwater retention, groundwater recharge, and sustained base flows. So it is physical function that produces the values that we appreciate and demand from our creeks and rivers. This is the key concept. One of the most well-documented riparian recovery stories yet is that of Bear Creek in Central Oregon. Bear Creek on this topo map is shown as a small perennial stream, the solid blue line. This section of Bear Creek was seasonal, long grazed for 100+ years. In the 1950s, the willow trees were sprayed to reduce water use and increase yield to downstream water supply reservoirs. In 1964, there was a 100+ year event, rain or snow, 12/24/64, and the stream downcut to bedrock. Between 1964 and 1977, the creek channel continued to widen. When documentation began in 1977, the tract supported 25 cow-calf pairs for 3 months of June, July, and August, or 75 AUMs. The vegetation was mostly upland species with some Baltic rush. Uplands were dominated by basin big sagebrush, and western juniper. The reference in the photo point, established in 1977, is the plump juniper on the right. Continuous grazing was identified as a hindrance, and management change was made. Initially, the pasture was vacated for 2 years to jumpstart this recovery process. Subsequently, grazing was returned seasonally from late winter, say mid-February, to early spring, about mid-April. Data and measurements collected at the Bear Creek site in 1977 at the onset of the recovery period include intermittent flow, no fish, wet riparian area, indication of sponge at 4 acres per mile, water storage at 1.5 acre-feet per mile, and active bank erosion at 12,500 feet. In 1983, when the photo was retaken, the plant communities had shifted to more rushes and sedges and riparian vegetation over upland vegetation, seen as dark green vegetation along the edge. The recent rise had deposited fine sediment, and it was being trapped by vegetation in the foreground. The vertical bank was starting to naturally lay back, and vegetation was establishing at the toe. The channel was observed to be narrowing. The 1986 photo shows a floodplain clearly developing on both sides of the creek, and most vegetation was of the water-loving kind, including Nebraska sedge, small fruit bulrush, beaked sedge, spike rush, brook grass, three-squared bulrush. In addition, reed canary grass, an invasive non-native plant, was noted. In June of 1987, a big storm occurred and floodwater deposited sediment across the entire floodplain. 2 months later, vegetation began to stabilize the newly deposited sediments with new roots and new surface growth coming up through the deposits. 1 year later, the flood deposits were completely incorporated into the floodplain, which was observed as storing more water just like a sponge. Observed increases in forage projection and energy dissipation were both noted. In 1993, this 1993 photo documented a drought. Droughts can be very important to the recovery process. As water tables fall, roots from rhizotomous vegetation follow the dropping water table, developing an interlaced mat under the channel bottom, further fortifying it against flood energies. In February of 1996, there was a rain or snow event which was estimated to be a 75-year event. Floodwaters were into the uplands as evidenced by debris on the right side of the photo. The photographer noted concern: will the channel have retained its dimension, its pattern and profile after the water recedes? Approximately 2.5 months after the previous photo, remnants of the sediment deposited during the flow can barely be seen. Most of it is obscured by robust vegetation colonizing and stabilizing the site. Beaver were noted as having moved back in, attempting to reestablish their lost dams. The shape and width of the floodplain on both sides of the creek and the lack of the vertical banks that existed in 1977 were all noted. After the summer growing season, the beaver dam was still intact and providing some water storage. The banks were fully vegetated and prepared for the next flood event. In 2001, the riparian area looked fully recovered. Taken in July, this photo shows the early stages of a 4-year drought on Bear Creek, and sadly we do not have a more recent photo. The creek channel was surveyed and profiled 3 times during the period of this documented recovery. In 1977, the channel was downcut and overly wide. By 1983, it had gained about 4 feet in some places, and it significantly narrowed. And by 2001, the bottom of the deepest part of the channel was sitting nearly 3 feet above where it had been in 1977. This channel change reflects the capture of 7,400 cubic yards of sediment per mile. Bear Creek, which we just discussed, is one of the most noted recovery stories ever recorded. It is currently a perennial flow blue ribbon trout stream from no fish in 1977. The wet riparian area, or sponge, was measured at 12 acres per mile, up from 4. The water storage capacity was calculated at 6.4 acre-feet per mile, up from 1.5. And only 100 feet of active bank erosion was measured within the reach, down from 12,500 feet. Today's lesson covered the riparian recovery and the process that guided the natural recovery on the Bear Creek site. For homework, revisit your data for your creek site and revisit the site if possible. Add to the log your ideas on its capability for improved riparian function. Identify any hindrances that may be present. Predict what some of the values that could be produced in greater abundance as a result of improved function. And be prepared to discuss your observations and predictions on Friday.